Hello and welcome to today's webinar, where today, of course, we find ourselves in a marketplace and in a world of planning where it feels like it takes forever to get our consent. So today we're going to talk about how we can maximize planning and get our approvals faster. And so to help me with that, I've invited David Kemp to come and talk to us today. Hi, David, are you there?
Hi. Hi, Paul. Hi, everyone.
Hey. Welcome. So for those who don't know who David is, so David does quite a few things. So David is a chartered surveyor, he's a lawyer, he's a planner, and now turned investor developer too. So he's got a bit of a broad depth of knowledge. So hopefully today we're in pretty safe hands as to help us through with this problem in effect. So perhaps before we kind of kick off, David, perhaps I could just ask you a simple question, help our viewers today get to know you a little bit. So what was it that sort of why start your planning consultancy? So what was it that kind of made you sort of decide to do that as a thing at the start?
Well, I was already in planning consultancy anyway. It's really a question of how I got into property, in a sense. Right. It was probably more than 20 years ago I started in property. My brother was already in property, working as an agent in the West End. The family had, on my mother's side, had been involved in property investment in the Bristol area where she grew up. So it's sort of in the family blood in a way. And then through being in planning consultancy and various ways of practicing in planning consultancy, either as a lawyer or as a property consultant generally, I then ended up setting up my own practice around the time of I think it was around the time of the credit crunch. Fallout from employment, had to do something, but I carried over contacts and clients with me, and here we are, some 10 years later.
Fabulous. Well, let's jump into let's sort of talk about how we can sort of get consents more quickly and how but kind of, I suppose, crucially, kind of maximize the potential of the sites at the same time, if we could.
Yeah.
So perhaps if we let you jump into your slides and share those, that'd be great.
Sure. Okay. Let me know when it's ready to share. Do I have to press anything?
Yeah, I think you should press the share screen.
Right.
I think the little green one at the bottom, hopefully.
Got it here.
Right. Choose your screen share, and then we should be good to go, hopefully.
Right.
There we go. See your screen. Yeah, lovely.
Play from start. Right.
Lovely.
Wonderful. Okay. So I'll get cracking then. There we go. So top tips to maximize planning and get approvals faster. So I'll just give you a whirlwind tour about who DRK Planning is, what we do, our experience, and then we're going to go through some points about what planning has looked like as a result of COVID, some of the key issues we're having to deal with, some top tips for speed and success, and when and how to engage with your planning consultant. So my practice, DRK Planning, has been going for about 10 years, but I've been involved in planning and development for about 20 years in total. We do all sorts of developments, residential, commercial and retail, but mostly residential. I've got a legal background. I've been private sector and the public sector as well. Most of our work is London and South East, but we do quite a lot of work elsewhere in England. We've got projects down the Southwest, Norfolk, Suffolk, Midlands and the North as well. And we've been involved at all sorts of levels as well, in terms of householder applications, all the way to schemes of 120 odd units. I've been involved in high court cases as well as an expert. So that's just a quick show reel of some of our clients or people I've worked with or for. Obviously, got the public sector there as well. And there's a few names there that you might recognize. So some of the projects that we've been involved in before, Somerford and Christchurch, that was a mixture of PD and prior approval, but then we got extension applications through for up to 46 flats in total. Leatherhead, that was a change of use application under the Class O PD rights to 30 flats in total with external changes. Then on all massive schemes that we deal with, some of them are much smaller, such as redevelopment of 6 garages in Fish Ponds Road to 2 semi-detached houses. But at the other end of the scale, some larger town centre developments, such as in Farnborough and Farnborough Road. The way in which we work with clients is normally around looking first at a high level basis in terms of assessing things such as the principal policy issues, talking to the clients about the risks that they're exposed to in terms of the market risks, acquisition structures, how that impacts upon timescales and timelines. And then we move around to the green side, and that's where we're looking at a strategy that perhaps hopefully fits in with that and suits that well. And then when you get into applications, to PD and prior approval, or then moving on to pre-apps with a council before then going to full applications or even outline applications in some cases as well. So it's a bit of a circular way of working around that that system with clients as well. So onto the key delays and issues in planning. The main ones, I've tried to sort of narrow them down. There are all sorts of reasons why we're encountering delays and issues in planning, but these are probably some of the main ones. So lack of officer response is often down to the fact that either an officer is not around, some of them seem to be on holiday perpetually, but some of them are also relatively inexperienced. They might be dealing with a new area of PD or prior approval, and they're sort of a bit like rabbits in the headlights, and they don't necessarily know how to respond. And it is sometimes a rather symptomatic that if for all sorts of reasons they're letting their caseload slip, then they're not necessarily being closely monitored in some cases by their line managers, because a lot of them are working from home. So it's not like they're in the office and they're the line manager's around, or they can just, if they can go into the line manager's office and just speak to them about how to deal with a particular application. So quite often there are reasons why they don't want to get on the phone to you, or they don't want to get on email to you. It's probably because they don't know how to deal with the application, or they're facing a heavy workload and they're trying to juggle that, and they've not quite put you at the top of the pile. So there's reasons around that, and the lack of PD knowledge sometimes plays into that lack of officer response. Also, between the two, sometimes when you're dealing, or they're dealing with PD or prior approval applications, they're under a large caseload pressure, so that the officers who are in charge of their caseload, their team leaders, are often telling them, don't spend too much time on these PD and prior approval applications. When they come in, they've got to be right first time. Don't keep on going back to the applicants. Just make the decision on the basis of the information you've got there. So even if the applicant is trying to get some information from you, or they're trying to work with you in some way, sometimes they're being told not to communicate in order to manage their workload and make sure that they don't lose time on larger and more complex projects. And that's very frustrating. And what we're finding, and what everybody is finding, is that there's very uneven application and dedication to these applications across local authorities as well. So, you know, the rules change in terms of policy. They're very much the same in terms of the statutory framework and PD and prior approval, but the way in which statutory framework can be applied, can be interpreted, the law around permitted development can be applied and interpreted. It can change from one local authority to another. And that in itself also creates a degree of friction, and is also symptomatic of that lack of PD knowledge. I don't have to explain to you what Nimbus is or Nimbus are. So we all get them in applications. It's often the case that, for instance, on larger schemes, you'll do your best to do a public presentation at the local village hall or local council, and put on a good show for everybody, and put on your best face and try not to get into arguments with anybody. And then they'll come along and then they'll tell you how wonderful your scheme looks and how interesting it looks. And then when your application goes in, the very same people who have told you actually to your face it's just what the area needs are the people who are probably the most guilty of stirring up all the ruckus around your application and objecting to it. So you don't know what you're dealing with a lot of the time. And so, you know, you've got to go through the motions to a certain degree and play that game in terms of stakeholder involvement. And then we see the same with planning committees going rogue, particularly annoying when officers have recommended a scheme for approval, but planning committees then, for their own reasons, and there can be all sorts of reasons at play there, they sometimes decide, well, we're going to go our own way on this. Planning and professional costs, that's obviously something that a lot of clients have to juggle with to a very, very great degree. It's a very, very difficult area on which to advise because of the degree of additional information that's often required, not just in full applications, but also in PD applications these days as well. So it's about getting to grips with that early on, so that before you put in your bids for sites, you've got a fair idea of what's involved. And then you've got issues around delays to commencement, and I'll explore that in further detail. But what we're talking about here is when you are proposing an application or a development, you get that through. You've also got other things at the other end, such as planning conditions to discharge. You've got Section 106 agreements as well to sort out as well. And those sorts of things take time, and they can hold up the scheme for quite a few months if you're not proactive enough about them. So in terms of the tips for speed and success, and in terms of speed, I probably have to sort of hurry along myself as well in this presentation, but there's room for questions at the end. So in terms of tips for speed and success, important to understand the principle of development as soon as you can. Obviously, if a scheme is unlikely to meet the principle for development in any particular case, don't waste too much time on it, because if you can overcome it, then many other things can be negotiated, such as design. But if you can't overcome it, then it's going to be a very short conversation with any council officer. Understanding what council objectives are and being able to communicate that with a good vision is very, very important. A picture speaks 1,000 words. And we're going to get into talking about CGIs and how and when you can use them. Planning by degrees. Don't go for everything all at once, but obviously you want to go for just enough that it still makes sense to do if that's going to be your fallback. So it's what we call salami slicing. You work your way through the application by degrees. Sometimes you can bite off more than you can chew in any particular planning case. Look for opportunities to add value, and I'll have some tips around that as well. And use time before committee effectively, because sometimes there is a long delay between when you know the scheme is going to be approved or recommended for approval by officers and when it gets into committee. And particularly when you're talking about gaps that come between those two events, recommendation by officers, decision or consideration by committee, those gaps may happen because of breaks in the political calendar. There may be, for instance, local elections going on. There may be other factors as well, such as summer holidays, school holidays, so on and so forth, and working out some strategies in relation to delays to commencement. So we're going to hurtle through some of these slides, but I'll pick out the key issues as we go. So in terms of the early review of the principle of development, I can't stress that enough, and it's important to use fallback positions such as permitted development and prior approval wherever you can. If you can't use them, then you're going to get into a very, very different world, and you're going to be having to deal with some key issues such as marketing of the current uses, particularly, for instance, if it's employment uses which are subject to, say, Article 4 directions that take those PD rights away. And then you've got no control over that market demand and who might come forward, and understanding that local market is also important to getting the right mix between resi and employment floor space in your schemes as well as being able to not only understand the local market from the point of view of putting GDVs on things from a commercial point of view, but also being able to have that conversation in a planning context with the officers who will also be looking at market need in relation to applying issues of the principle of development, because the principle of development is closely related to objectives in planning. So if the council has an objective to make sure they don't lose too much employment floor space in an area, they might be inclined to take PD rights away and have Article 4 directions. And that means that you're going to have to get into that conversation about the local market for employment in that area. So you've got some issues to unpick there. Now, planning objectives and vision, we had a scheme that we looked at, it was a few years ago. It's actually one of the most exciting schemes and most interesting schemes I've been involved in. Not the biggest, but this scheme, which you see the images for on the right-hand side, and they're both CGIs. This was an old ruined mansion. It had burnt down in the 1950s. It had a grade 2 listed coach house and stables on the right hand side, that small part 1, part 2 story building that you see. It had a large mansion, which you'll see there on the left of shot, and out of shot there's a gardener's cottage. Now the gardener's cottage and the ruined mansion were both locally listed. It's also in the green belt, and it was awash with TPOs, but apart from which it's quite a simple site. The important thing here is that we approach this from the point of as a heritage restoration project, again tapping into understanding that this is a heritage asset, or several heritage assets we're dealing with here, and therefore from the point of dealing with the council, their objective would be to see something happens on this site. The fact that they were locally listing a building that had basically been burnt down by a fire decades ago, and put their own local listing on it when English Heritage, as it then was, refused to put a statutory listing on it, tells you everything you need to know about their approach to this site. They took a conservation approach here. So where other developers had walked away from this, saying it's in the green belt, it's probably not residential development any longer, clearly the signals sent out by the way the council treated this site before indicated they were looking for something to happen back on this site. So we tapped into that, created a vision, created a brand around it with the client, and therefore went in with a very high level discussion to the development management officers, particularly to the head of development management. And we had that conversation with them to steer them towards something exciting can happen on this site. Let's work together. And then we worked on the detail around that. So once you build up that momentum, you know, it can be great. And we, you know, there are all sorts of opportunities. There was basements that could be opened up again. There were rear gardens that could be re-landscaped. You need a lot of patience for it, but certainly if you move in the right direction and you create that vision, then the case could be won very much before you get to committee, because you fix an image in people's minds and you take that top-down approach all the way through the planning process. Again, in communicating ideas around vision and scale and size of development, recent scheme that we got through for 20 units in Finchley. The version at the top you see is a 9-unit scheme with a shop on the park ground floor. So that was the top left and right is that scheme for 9 flats. Then we went in for a scheme for 26 flats and completely residential, which is the bottom 2 images. We had to come down to 20 units on that scheme and take that top floor off. But again, the best way of putting these ideas across is often in terms of CGIs. 2D images, very, very difficult to do in a really persuasive and convincing way. Again, that just illustrates how 2D images, looking rather flat, very, very difficult to do, and not half as attractive, that bottom image, as the bottom image can look there as well. It's much more of an enhancement. Still not quite enough as far as the officers were concerned. They were still concerned with the additional floor, but in most cases, you will have a better chance putting in CGIs early enough if you possibly can. Now, the reason we went for 9 flats before 26 flats was to bag the scale and the size of the scheme first. They were very, very large flats, so we're looking to maximize the site coverage and the scale and the height as much as we could, but to do so below the affordable housing threshold at a level of the number of flats which wouldn't draw too much attention politically. So if you put in a scheme for 9 flats, it's going to encounter fewer objections than a scheme for 26 flats. We had something like 75 objections to the scheme for 26 flats. There were only about 4 objections to the scheme for 9 flats, and therefore the 9 flats one went through under delegated powers. So it's a quicker and easier way to bag a permission on site, raise the alternative use value, and then use that planning permission to refinance as well. So you can stay in the scheme for longer if you need to try to work within the bulk of what you've just secured and improve the density, which is what we did. We later got consent for 20 flats within the same size, scale, bulk and volume of the 9 flat scheme. Now, national space standards creates all sorts of limitations, but also possible opportunities. And this is a scheme that we were involved in with Equa Group. And The image on the bottom, you'll see the first 3 floors there, all part of the office scheme that was the office to resi scheme that they got PD for first. So we got 44 flats there. And then we got another 9 flats on top of that building through that part clad and pot brick extension that you see there as well. Now, some of the units, they were 1-bed units, but they had a small study room there. And each of those study rooms, they were not quite big enough for bedrooms. The units themselves weren't large enough to create 2-bedroom units, but there was space that could be used there. And there were certainly windows and opportunities for outlook and sunlight and daylight. And so each of those 5 additional rooms, because we did this over 5 of the units in the 9 flats that we added on top, each of those 5 additional rooms added in the local market £15,000 to the GDV. So that's a total of £75,000 of added value right there. Again, on smaller schemes, again, crisscrossing over to vision and using CGIs, the scheme at the top was refused by the council. It was a scheme to break down the ground floor flat to 3 units. One of the issues the council had was lack of amenity space. We worked with the client to find a better outlook and some pocket amenity space, some pocket garden space, as we call it, right on the ends of those 2 units on the side, with also a slightly larger garden on the very back unit, and right to the rear, as you see a communal garden as well. So illustrating that creating opportunities for enhancing external amenity space can get you over the line in terms of planning, but obviously will add GDV and value there as well. Now, we've talked about Nimbus and dealing with neighbour objections, and sometimes it's a case of you can really only do your best in some cases. Public engagement was particularly difficult in lockdown. Early engagement with resident groups and neighbours and local councillors is ideal, but it was very, very difficult during lockdown because you couldn't have larger public meetings for what they were worth. So never underestimate dealing with neighbours and how difficult they can be. I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you this, but it was particularly difficult here because we had a school next door as well. So where you have institutional uses like schools next door in the neighbourhood, all be prepared for mum's net to jump on your development and complain about it in all sorts of ways. So make friends with the school and with the school governors as soon as you can, because it's good to have them on board if you possibly can. Now, we're going to go into a great deal of detail over the process in terms of getting applications through, but certainly one of the things that can help, and now we are back in the room with members and presenting to planning committees, if you possibly can, what will happen before the meeting takes place is there will sometimes be a member's site visit. The committee members will come down, have a look at the site. They won't speak to you, they've got to keep their distance, but if you can mark out the site or provide visual aids, you're providing a mini touch point with the decision makers, and it's seen as a way of being seen to be helpful in a way. Usually the chairman will be there as well, and remember, chairmans usually have casting votes when it comes to voting in committee, and in fact in the scheme that I presented you before on the 20 flat scheme, when we went down from 26 flats to 20 units, the chairman had to use their casting vote, and we got the chairman on board really by the way in which we handled the member site visit, but also the way in which we pitched our case generally. Now, there was a lot of delay between the officers recommending for approval back in September last year until it went to committee in November. So what we tried to do was we used that time to put in further information. We identified where the pre-commencement conditions were, conditions that have to be discharged before you can make a start on site. Because if you leave that until later, until you've got the consent, the problem is you have to apply for the discharge of the pre-commencement conditions, which takes another 2 to 3 months. So if you can provide that information early enough whilst you're waiting to go to committee, then the relevant officers can simply just tick that box, write that off, and you don't have to, then you can remove the pre-commencement triggers from the conditions themselves, and you don't have to apply later. So it can save you about 2 or 3 months to get on site. You can also start drafting things like Section 106 agreements and hopefully get those to drafting or final engrossment stage ready for signature the moment you come out of committee, if all goes well. Traffic and parking, important to identify those at an early enough stage as well. Don't underestimate how long these take to sort out, and sometimes these assessments can only be done at certain times of the year outside of school holidays as well. So important to identify things like that as soon as possible. And also, for instance, if any of you are buying sites or looking at buying sites which have, for instance, like ecological conditions on them and bat survey conditions, think about whether or not they need to be discharged and when they can be discharged, because some of these surveys can only be done at certain times of the year, for instance, during the summer months. And if you miss that window, then you're going to have to wait and it's going to delay your scheme. Affordable housing, just a very quick run on this. Don't trust building cost indices now. I think everybody knows what's happening with build cost inflation. You probably need a QS involved at a very, very early stage. It has a massive impact on being able to keep your affordable housing cost exposure down as much as you possibly can. Throw in all the planning and professional costs that you can. Make sure where you're using community infrastructure levy, you've indexed that as well, and you're using up-to-date costings too. Where we were also including contributions to the neighbouring primary school, which was a free school, we also included those within our assessments as well. So you just throw in everything lock, stock and barrel. And also one of the advantages to getting that 9-unit scheme through was it increased the land value above what was there in the first place. It was initially just a small single-storey community shed, so you can imagine the existing use value of that is going to be minuscule compared to the land value for the 9-unit scheme that we got as well. So that helps to narrow the gap in terms of what we'd have to pay on affordable housing by increasing that land value, because it all lumps onto the cost side of the equation, and therefore you lump that on top of build costs advised by your QS, and hopefully you can mitigate your affordable housing strategy. In the end, I think our affordable housing contribution was only just over £40,000 for a scheme that we added £10 million in GDV to the site as well. So not a bad result. So definitely these sites can make a difference. Look for town centre and edge of site centre sites. That's what the scheme looked like, or the site looked like in the first place. There's all sorts of opportunities that you can look for there. So once you find that opportunity, what are my 4 top tips for managing those opportunities? Well, I think we need to start with market risk. You need to identify whether or not there's any PD. If there's no PD, then you might have to prove the demand for that particular existing use that you're going to lose, such as employment use. What's the size of the local market you're looking at? What's the number of units that we're proposing? Are we going to be swamping that market and therefore artificially depressing unit values as a result? I've mentioned a few other issues there, such as density and height and dwelling mix. You need to look around these issues, not just from a planning point of view, but understand the dynamics of your local market, because sometimes these do come up, as I have shown, in the planning issues as well. I'm not a property lawyer, but always check with the property lawyer whether or not there are any restrictive covenants notices, such as options to purchase land, charges that haven't been discharged, such as the vendor's loans, and also if you're dealing with pubs, especially, assets of community value sometimes show up as restrictions. If there are existing tenants on the site, they might have security of tenure. So you might need to think about whether or not, or how quickly you can get vacant possession from them. That will depend upon whether or not they can resist the grant of a new tenancy. Now, when one is looking at an application for planning permission, one often uses that in order to argue that you're looking to undertake substantial works of construction as a developer, and therefore you use that as a ground to resist the grant of a new tenancy to tenants, and it helps you to get them out easier and quicker. It is more difficult to use that basis under PD and prior approval schemes in order to get vacant possession earlier. That's because substantial, in terms of works of construction, has often been taken by the courts to mean you've got to do structural works. So you might need to think about how you can sort of contrive or weave that into the actual implementation when you're looking at PD or prior approval, such as breaking through structural walls, etc. And it might mean a holistic approach, getting your planning, design, structural and legal teams all around together to devise a scheme that not only meets the PD and prior approval requirements, but it allows you to pass that test of substantial works of construction. Now, this is a scheme that we looked at a few years ago back. It's in Chesham, it's in Buckinghamshire, and the leases had very different. Some of them had a very short period to expiry. Some of them had no security of tenure. Some of them were much longer to get out as well. And the longer and more riskier ones were given a colour code of red. The ones that were probably going to have their leases expiring in the next few months given a colour code of green, or if they had no security of tenure as well. So it gave us an idea as to where the problem tenants, if you like, might be. And then you could build up a phasing plan perhaps around that as well, and build up your development strategy around that. But bear in mind that a scheme that doesn't think through this properly could be left with a situation where you are effectively becoming an investor and getting a commercial rent for a longer term, say up to 5 years, because you can't get people out on shorter leases, rather than a commercial development and change of use to residential. So bear in mind that when you're looking at these sorts of sites, you need to have those conversations early with your development partners or your investors, that there are those risks, and therefore they might be having to look at a scheme, depending upon what happens with those risks, on an investment basis before they recoup their money or their investment, rather than on a development basis as well. So you need to think about that carefully. And very quickly on planning restrictions, building and environmental restrictions, you've got the obvious ones like Article 4 directions, unimplemented consents, assets of community value. Sang and SAM pops up as well, often in the south, in my experience, in the south east around the Thames Basin area. There's a certain amount of money you have to pay, it's a fixed amount of money you have to pay as a mitigation strategy in some local authorities to stop people going to nature reserves where there's danger to local flora or fauna, and therefore the council, what they do is they set up an artificial reserve called a site of alternative natural green space, which is what SANG stands for, and therefore the money that they're taking is used in order to afford the provision of that. And the maintenance and management of that is what SAM is. It's a strategic access and maintenance and management payment. And then you've got other matters such as trees, flooding, contamination, all these sorts of things can impact upon the developable area of the land that you're looking for. And I've picked up on some of them there. I've also mentioned, for instance, ecology. Obviously, if you're looking at vacant buildings or sites, you need to be aware of that. Always check floor areas and parking spaces as well. We were dealing with a building once where it was advertised with 45 parking spaces, sorry, 75 parking spaces. It only actually had 45 when I counted them. Don't know, there must have been a typo or something like that. And also another site where the client got to exchange of contracts, but when they did their own measured survey on a building of about 28,000 square foot as advertised, it was actually about 5,000 square foot of that as well. So always check that. You know, if you're missing 5,000 square foot from a building, that's going to make a massive difference. So always check these floor areas and parking spaces, things like that, very, very early on. Flood risk is also an important one to check as well, because you'll need mitigation. You might need to increase floor levels, etc., and look at how you can do that, and think about access on and off the site as well. And some local authorities are very resistant to that. And also things like asbestos, not mentioned on here, but I've heard situations where people have done a walkover survey of a site. There's no asbestos visibly on the site, but the previous owner took the asbestos sheeting off the buildings and buried it under the earth somewhere in the back garden. and it turned up later after the deal was done. So sometimes you need to do some trial pits as well. So all those sorts of things can come up. And in terms of how we work, usually a very high level light touch review first before we get into the paid planning service of detailed review. Then we'll discuss with the client whether or not you need a PD application or prior approval application, go for pre-app and then full application or outline application, as we did with the Somerford and Christchurch case on your right-hand side. We went for 26 units first, I think, and then it was 27 on PD, and then we got the rest by extensions up to 46 flats by way of full planning. And that's how to get in contact with me. So that's a quick whiz through, and I hope that has been useful, and no doubt quite a few questions. Or if you might feel more like him. So anyway,
well, before we get on to those, let's just jump in. And what I'd like to do next is I'd like to just quickly have a look at perhaps how some of this can be implemented. So how can we kind of help here at Nimbus with some of this stuff? So some of the key things that I think I've heard have been sort of setting ourselves up to succeed. So looking for buildings where PD rights might apply to start with. And I guess if we're going out and buying stuff on market, then what I hear quite a lot is that those opportunities are quite expensive and a bit overpriced, and people are trying to kind of get those things to work. So what we talk about a lot here at Nimbus is outbound letter campaigning to find sites off market in effect. And I think if the plan is, as David's saying, is the way to work, which is to go for stuff with a PD backbone, if you like, so you can go in with confidence that you can get a PD rights to start with. That's going to make the change of use much easier if residential is the end game. And then we can go in and we can tweak those and push those consents harder in effect and get more out of them. So I'm going to have a quick log into Nimbus and have a little play around and find some opportunities based on that. So we have a nice backbone of PD that's going to apply to these buildings first. And then we'll go on a little journey and have a look at perhaps some planning constraints around a particular property. Have a look at how similar applications nearby went on, as we sort of get that feeling for, is there NIMBYism in this site? It's going to be a real problem for us or not, and how might we be able to understand what people did on that particular scheme, and then help look at kind of local design teams and this sort of stuff. And I suspect we'll bump into David in that little search as well in in his entries in various data sets that we have here at Nimbus, and then just have a look at some of the financial assessments that can happen with Nimbus as well. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask people to pop some locations into the chat for me, so I can go off and have a look at some opportunities. So if we can open up the chat and pop some locations into there, I've got Sheffield is the first one that's there, Suffolk, Leamington Spa, Oxford, Croydon. Any of these take your fancy, David? I'll let you kind of pick whichever one you fancy out of that lot.
Okay, so which ones they were there? Because I was answering some of the questions.
We've got Sheffield, Suffolk, Liverpool St Anne's, Leamington Spa, that's my hometown, Oxford, Croydon, Coventry.
Let's go for Sheffield.
Sheffield. Here we go. So let's just have a look at what we're doing here. So this is Nimbus. So what Nimbus is doing is it goes off and it uses this sort of Google-powered search up here in effect. So I can type anything into that location. So Nimbus has gone off, found the centre of Sheffield in effect, and then has plotted all of these freehold properties. It's plotted 3,500 properties in the map for me, little kind of white outline showing me freehold ownership in that location. And I'm going to just get rid of that for a second, because what I want to do to start with is I want to zoom out and just kind of take a little look at Sheffield from a sort of a holistic view in effect, kind of a macro view of Sheffield in effect. So the way I do that, I use a little tool in the top right corner over here called location analysis. And really kind of two bits here I want to kind of focus on: the comparable section and the market analysis to start with. So the first thing I want to do is I want to look at Sheffield and I want to plot across the map average residential values. It's got a slightly slow internet connection here, but in effect what this is showing me is it's showing me the average sales prices over the last 18 months of properties in Sheffield, plotted then against the size of those buildings were, and then averaged across a sort of a demographic area in effect, a neighbourhood area in effect. So what we can see is that in central Sheffield, average sales price is just over £200 a foot. And as we come out sort of southwest out of Sheffield, we start to find some of those numbers shoot up. So we get sort of £300 a foot out here, and sort of some of these sort of surrounding areas, sort of 335 a foot down as we go sort of down towards Silverdale School. But the contrast to that is kind of up into the northeast over here. We have much lower values, these kind of £90 a foot, kind of the less than the value or less than the price to build these things in effect. So if we're thinking about PD as its core, and we're going to be converting stuff into residential, I obviously need to make sure there's enough value in that area when I go and build these units out and try to sell them, that those sales prices are high enough for me to be able to get a sensible profit out of these. So typically what this will mean is that the opportunities will sit kind of to the southwest where those values are higher in effect. So that's the first thing I want to kind of understand. So really I'm going to be sort of searching down this southwest corner in effect because of those higher values. Get rid of that for now. The next thing I want to do is I want to jump into our system called the Elite Plus system. And I'm going to start with a new hot one. So Class MA, the PD rights that apply to Class E up to 15,000 square feet. So we can probably get about 30 units as a base case with some of these bigger ones off that. And I'm going to click on, so the way this works, I click on this little button here. Nimbus goes off and it looks across the map and it says, where do I see Class E buildings that are up to 15,000 square feet, just over 1,500 square meters actually, so nearly 16,000 square feet, that then aren't in Article 2.3 land in effect. So we've got a number of those planning constraints removed out of the calculation effect. It then says, well, where do they sit next to residential property? There's kind of a residential feel to that location. So that if we then do try to paint a picture and a vision of what this building might be, it's not going to sit and compete with where it's neighbouring. So we're not trying to convert an office building in the middle of an office park. We're trying to convert an office where we have a street scene of house, office, house, where that vision of that office being a house or a flat feels right and feels sensible in effect. So Nimbus has gone off and plotted those properties for me. And then the simple thing to do is then start looking across those areas for those particular properties and see what they look like. So I kind of zoom in and have a look at this one down here just for interest. This kind of looks like a vaguely interesting little opportunity. I'm going to click on that particular property there. So what I have here is I have a Class E gymnasium. So obviously Class E now includes some gym, provided there's not a swimming pool, I think is the key thing, David, isn't it? So the gym going into
that's yes, one of the factors, yeah. The
other use is so in effect we have a 4,000 square foot gym here under Class E. What Nimbus is saying then is for this part of Sheffield, the sales prices around there are about £240 a foot. It's allowing a conversion cost of £100 a foot, and it's saying then that the gym itself is worth about £4.50 as a rental level, and applying a 7% net initial yield, it's saying it's worth about 60 quid a foot. So really it's kind of worth existing use value about 250, converted about 400, it's worth about £1 million off that base simple conversion model, if you like. It's checked the fact that these buildings in front of it are residential, and therefore the change of use of that particular building would seem very sensible. The vision of that location feels like it's residential. Similar sort of thing down here, I suspect, as well. So we've got down here a 6,000 square foot Class E garage. Again, this is sort of £3.50 a foot this time around. So it's sort of 7% to £45 a foot rather than 60. It's a very quick way to go and find those buildings where there's a good chance that those buildings then have a sensible chance of getting a PD right to change the use of it. That would give us kind of a conversion baseline where we can then go and start being clever with that and then build on that to try and put another unit on top, or to knock it down and rebuild as perhaps a more comprehensive scheme and this sort of thing. So that's kind of, I suppose, where I would start with this sort of searching effect. I suppose the thing is, perhaps the question I'm perhaps thinking is, well, that's all fine, there's buildings there with opportunities, so what? Well, the trick to that then is to really just letter campaigning the owners of these buildings in effect. So the way we would do that is we'd click on the on this little link here. This is the type and number. That brings out the information panel, so it's showing all the information about this particular property, size of it, there's your site area, commercial uses, there's the detail around it there, so we can see all of that. Show me the planning history. So this is going to show me then, in fact, we're a little bit late on this actually. They've already got a consent on this. Interesting. They've got a consent to demolish the garage and office building and put 11 flats and 3 duplex apartments in a 4-story block, including ground floor parking on that particular property. So we know that's now got a consent. Maybe move on to the next thing, but it hasn't actually been implemented yet. So they clearly aren't particularly convinced that those numbers back in 2018 necessarily work. So this probably is expiring at the moment. So perhaps an interesting one to go and have a look at. So the way we would do that is we go and click on the Find Owner button. That would in effect, it allows me to buy a title register for the private owner's details, and then add that site to my workflow, which is like a little glorified Kanban board, if you like. It puts a little pin on the site there, and it loads then my sites into this sort of Kanban board here, where I've got opportunities, progressing, legals, all that kind of stuff. So I can set up a number of stages, and I can manage my sites through those various stages of workflow, if you like. That's all fine. So I save it into there. What I can then do is I can download that into Excel, where it will then bring the information out of Nimbus with the owner's details onto that little Excel spreadsheet. So I can very quickly mail merge to all of those owners. The thing that we find typically is the case is that about 100 to 150 opportunities, that many letters typically will generate a deal that you buy yourself. That's typically the number that we see. We used to quote 100. Sort of post-COVID, we sort of moved that up ever so slightly, maybe 150, 125, 150 should certainly get you that volume of, should get you a site in effect. What's kind of interesting when you sort of zoom out and sort of look even in a place like Sheffield, where those values are quite limited, you'll see sort of the number of these opportunities that are around, and how kind of simple it is to go and identify 100 of those, 125, 150 of those, and send letters out to those opportunities. So that's kind of the first part of all of this. I suppose the bit that then kind of makes me think is, well, actually, provided I start getting some interest from some of these, which I will do, then I suppose the next thing I want to understand is sales value. So what are the values of properties that have sold within, say, the last 2 years within this particular location, indexed up to today's values in effect? So that's what this is showing me. This is showing me all of those properties that have sold around that area. I can sort of set these various bits and pieces. If I'm going to build flats, I could perhaps just filter just to flats, and I can set the sizes of those to say, just show me the flats at the right sort of size. But what we can see is if we sort of zoom in, actually there's some quite interesting numbers that are coming back off this, aren't there? Let's have a look at some of this stuff, because sort of down here, there's sort of £400 a foot was achieved on the property down here, which seems pretty full actually. So really kind of interesting. Have a look at those and see, well, what does £400 a foot look like? So it's 700 square foot unit there, sold for £675,000. In today's value, that's 720,000 actually. It's kind of gone up by sort of 50 grand in the last sort of 12 months. Quite a big growth, kind of, I guess, part of COVID and this sort of stuff. That was 10 Kenwood Bank, Sheffield. Actually, we can go and click on this little find particulars link here. So that was number 10 there that sold there. Often these buildings are sold through Rightmove, and so you can often go and find particulars of those properties to go and see what they look like inside. Since the one below has got sort of sets of pictures and floor plan and this sort of stuff, so we can really kind of build that picture around what does that sort of comparable truly mean, and is it directly comparable with the properties that we're putting forward ourselves or going to build ourselves. So we get very clear on what those sales prices are and make sure that we're comfortable that our appraisal stacks up. And I suppose the other thing that's often interesting when it comes to this sort of off-market opportunity is that often you'll hit these owners before they've decided to go and put buildings onto the market. And so what that means is that you kind of need to be helping those owners understand what the true value is of what they've got. And then, of course, if you can do a subject planning deal where perhaps you're sharing some of the upside with them, you can explain to them why, if you're sharing that planning gain with them, why the offer you're making is way in excess of what the buildings are actually worth. And that's why our commercial comparables can be quite useful. Because what I can do is, like I said, well, if there's a little garage down here, then actually I can pop on these commercial comparables and I can zoom out. So, show me all the buildings that have maybe sold in the last, say, couple of years or something like that. And then you can sort of see these little, these yellow spots here mean that those buildings are industrial buildings. So I can then sort of work through these properties and say, well, actually, what does an £89 a foot building look like across Sheffield? And I can go and have a look at the detail of that particular property, click that link there, it will show me the particular building. I can go and then quote that back to the owner of the property, saying, well, this is why I think your building's worth what I think it's worth. This is what 80 quid a foot looks like. This is what £40 a foot looks like. So what £20 a foot looks like, £35 a foot. So very quickly I can build that picture for the owner to say, this is what the marketplace is saying for what your building's worth. And actually, if I paid it more than that, because actually there's some planning gain to be had in the buildings that I've been showing you, they've got higher than 25% return on cost as the profit baked into off existing use values. Then of course, then we're in a really, really great place, frankly. On top of that, I can see commercial availability. So are there any buildings nearby that are on the market? There's an office building to let over the road, so perhaps worth more as offices. Well, there's your details around all of that. And commercial property partners are actively trying to let that office behind this particular property I'm looking at. So actually, they'd be a really useful person to go and speak to, or kind of company to go and speak to, just to see what the local marketplace is and see if there's actually a very strong office market I should be considering, or something like that for the scheme too. So super quick ways of understanding that. I suppose if we're looking for commercial buildings, and again, this little yellow colouring is what I'm interested in. So there's a 4.5 to 6,000 square foot leasehold industrial building there to let, again with commercial property partners, same company sort of coming back again. So this is it here, and of course then I can sort of see, well, that's sort of rental levels of 29,000 for a 4,500 square foot building, so about £5 a foot is what's there, which is very much in line with what Nimbus was quoting for that garage, sort of 450 a foot, I think what it was saying. So to help me build that picture around what their asset is actually worth, so I can make that really kind of clear to them. So hopefully that's all useful. The other thing I sort of promised was to talk about some of the planning constraints. So some of the questions that we've got, I suppose, is around, well, are these buildings listed? Are they in flood zones and this sort of stuff? Those are some of the things that David mentioned as kind of key things to go and check before you start engaging with your planner. And of course, what Nimbus allows you to do is to go and see those on the map. So we go off and we can plot the flood zones. We can see here that the flood zone sort of cruises across the north of this particular site. So actually the property I was looking at a moment ago may just have nibbled into a flood zone over there. Class MA, kind of the upper parts and stuff wouldn't matter with flood zones, I suspect. But and then listed buildings, listed buildings around, so that would plot those in the map. We see one over here, and sort of a few around the property, but the property itself being clear. Things like Greenbelt again, AOMB, Triple SI, all these things can be plotted on the map so we can see where those issues might arise. I suppose on top of that, what might be interesting to have a little look at is this. So this is the what we call our planning overlay. This is showing us planning applications across the map in this area. And I suppose this could be really kind of helpful for us, because what it's going to show me is sort of red spots where there's a residential planning application in place. And just over the road there, I can see there's sort of a residential application there for some tweaks to a particular property. There's a bigger yellow red spot there as well. So some tweaking around to the existing building. A little zoom out, see if we search a little bit further afield. So the red spots are the residential applications. So perhaps up here there's some big ones there, hopefully. So amendments there, external alterations. So there's the change of use of the office under B1A, now Class E, as 59 flats in effect. So the change of use from office old B1, now Class E, into 59 residential units. And that went through in May 2021 and got a consent at that point. I can go off, click the link, it'll take me through to go and see that particular planning application. That will help me then understand some of these issues around NIMBYism, because what I would find is I'd find documents and I'd find letters from locals saying, not in my backyard, which I haven't actually got there. What I have got as well is I've got information around what the sill looks like, I've got flood risk assessment, I've got noise impact assessment. So I've got a list of things that are perhaps useful as part of when I'm supporting my application going in for the change of use of perhaps an office building that I'm finding under the Class MA PD rights. And I can see then the kind of things that have had to be submitted with similar applications nearby in effect. You can see how the consultees replied and all this sort of stuff. So that hopefully is helpful. The comment sections, there may be some kind of consultee comments and this sort of stuff, and sort of see how that application progressed in effect. There are some other things we can do too. If we kind of want to get a bit sort of deeper into this, so the kind of chevron here allows us to use what we call our planning exports. And what this allows me to do is to search Sheffield Council for either residential opportunities, so I can go off and find just residential planning applications, or I can find PD rights. So where do I see planning applications that mention the word lawful development certificate, or prior education, or prior approval? And I can put more words in there if I want to too, but I can ultimately just export that into Excel and see what applications have been put forward that mention those particular words. We'll see if we if we find much across Sheffield. It'll be interesting to see what comes back. So let's have a look at this. So here's what that shows me in effect. So here we have all these various, on the left-hand side here we have the location that the system found the planning application. This is checked every night, or it's every half hour actually, I think this is checked for. In the middle here we have the proposals. We can start to look down this list and see what applications are being submitted. Some of this is kind of extensions and this sort of stuff. So what we could do as part of this is we could use the negative keyword section on that same planning export to remove the words extension, for example. That would then remove some of these sort of smaller applications. So we can go and find the applications that are change of use or this sort of stuff. In fact, what I might do is I might just change this. Let's go for something a bit more aggressive. Let's go for planning applications in Sheffield for residential opportunities in effect. And let's export that instead, because this is going to show us, within this is going to show us where those change of uses are for offices to residential, all that kind of good stuff, as well as the out and out residential planning applications in the in that location. So here we go here. So here's our list there. So these are all the applications here. Let's have a little look what we can find. I'm not finding anything particularly exciting here, am I? Which is not, it's not very good, is it? Let's do a little, let's speed this up for a second and let's just do this instead. So let's jump into here and let's type the word office into there and see if we can find an office PD rights conversion. Well, there's one there, isn't it? Change of use offices to resi. And over here, then we can see Intelligent Money Trustees Limited did that. They bought it in 2018, paid that for it. And they used Scott Dunwell at BBIC Innovation Way, Barnsley, which is NYP Architectural Services in effect, to go and get that consent for them. So super quick ways to go and see all of that. Hopefully all of that has been helpful. I feel like we probably looked quite deeply at Nimbus now. So what I would like to suggest that we did is jump back into the slides. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to give you a sort of whistle-stop tour as to how we might find opportunities with something like Nimbus. There are multiple ways of finding it, about sort of 15 or 20 ways in which you can find opportunities using Nimbus, about 8 with Elite and another sort of 10 or 12 with the Elite Plus system. I've tried to show you how we can understand what planning constraints might affect a particular site. I've tried to show you how we might find similar planning applications nearby with that planning overlay. I've tried to show you how we might find similar applications using the planning export and see who the agents were and see who those local developers are trusting with their as their kind of design team to really look after their schemes for them. And I've tried to show you how their financial assessment might be supported with some commercial comparables, residential comparables, and sort of bring all that to life for you. Depending on what you're looking for, we have an Elite Plus system here, which will allow you to target either commercial conversion, which has kind of been really the topic of today's discussion. We also have a particular group of strategies that make up our residential land and airspace package, and indeed HMO packages too.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. Well, I think on that note, what I would like to do is firstly, thank you, David, for your time today, for a super presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And then finally, just a thank you to you all for watching. Hopefully it's been useful today. Good luck with your planning applications. Hopefully today's given you a chance to accelerate those through and get the most out of your schemes. I've been Paul Davis. We've been Nimbus Maps. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon. All the best. Bye for now.